Hi, I'm Warwick from Harder and Steenbeck. Thanks again for sending in so many questions in response to our videos. We're going to make a few more videos dealing with those and hopefully shedding some light on the things that you've been experiencing with your airbrush so that you're able to unlock more of the creative potential of this wonderful tool. So the first question today is quite a loaded topic. The question is, what do I need to know about different paint brands and their consistency? Now, I'm not quite sure how to interpret this question, so I'm just going to give it my best shot. So there's actually less difference now between the paint brands than there has been in years gone by. And I think the main driver of this is the quality of the pigment grinds has got better and better and better over the years. And this has really been the principal problem that we've struggled with the airbrush in years gone by. And you can kind of know if a paint brand doesn't have a good fine pigment grind, because typically what you'll see is when you're painting, doesn't matter how much air pressure you put onto the airbrush or how perfectly maintained your airbrush is, there always seems to be a little bit of graininess to the way that the color goes down. No matter how much you thin it, you can't seem to get rid of that graininess. And sometimes you'll see some flecks around the outside of the spray pattern. Now that's typically caused by a paint which doesn't have the finest grind on the pigments. Now, it's something that's not easy to achieve because every pigment, every color behaves slightly differently. Some are easier to grind into a finer paste than others. They typically take different amounts of grinding time, the various pigments, to reach the same consistencies. So it's quite a vexed topic generally if you're trying to make a paint. But what you should see is, when you thin a paint down to a consistency that's correct for the airbrush, so just to recap that, the best way that I know to test the consistency of a paint and know that it's right for the airbrush is once you've mixed it with your thinner, okay, and always use the same thinner as your paint brand. Once it's mixed, dip the end of an old needle into it, the blunt end is fine, and then pull it out. And what you want to see is you want to see the paint dripping off that needle, not falling off it like water would, that's too thin, but the drip wants to be steady, and you don't want to see the drip being elastic. So if it's kind of, like coming down from the end of the needle and sort of stretching out and then breaking off, that's too thick. You want to have a steady drip with no elasticity on the drip. If you've prepared your paint like that, and you're sure that your airbrush is correctly maintained and everything, and you're sure you've got a good airbrush, when you paint with that, if you're seeing this kind of granular nature to the spray pattern, or you're seeing some sort of little spatters around the edge, then maybe you want to reconsider your paint brand. What you should be seeing when your paint's prepared like that is you should be seeing this really smooth, very misty atomization going on to whatever you're painting. And another key way to be able to tell a good paint is the sound. Now this is really, really hard to explain, but I think some of you, if you experiment with this, you'll start to understand. If you prepare some paint that's clearly too thick, spray it through your airbrush, and as you pull the trigger back, listen really carefully to the sound it makes. It just sounds a bit rough. And when it's prepared correctly, it sounds smooth. So do that with a paint that you know is really, really good. Now, a paint that isn't good, even when it's thinned to the right consistency, those larger pigment particles will cause that paint to sound strange, though this might sound to you to be talking about the sound of paint. You will notice that the paint sounds a little bit different when it sprays. So you're looking for this very soft, kind of smooth sound as the paint gets atomized. Obviously, it's similar to what water sounds like when you atomize it, but somehow it's a little bit more muted than water. And that's a really, really good way to judge, A, if your paint's at the right consistency for the pressure that you're using, and B, if you've got a good paint with all of the other factors being constant. So, complicated answer to a complicated topic. A summary of that basically is, if your paint is well prepared and you know your airbrush is a quality item, whatever brand it is, and there's lots of good ones out there, you want to have a good sound from it that doesn't sound rough and inconsistent as you're painting. and you should see a perfect spray pattern going down without any flecks around it or without any granularity to the way it looks when it goes down. So hopefully that gives you all the tools you need to cover that particular question. Love this one. What are some ways to practice airbrushing? So this is a great question, and the reason why it's really good is because there's several factors involved in successful airbrushing, and some of them don't really need practicing. So for example, one of the things that once you've learned it, is paint preparation. So we've got other videos on that topic, so I won't get into it. But the reason why that's important to identify as something that you don't need to practice once you know what to do is because the paints that most of us use when we airbrush are acrylic paints nowadays. And acrylic paints do have this characteristic where occasionally they can dry on the tip of your needle, and it means that you have to deal with that and you can't necessarily airbrush seamlessly. And when you want to practice, you just want to practice technique. A great way to do that is by using food dye. Okay, so you can buy food dye in pretty much any supermarket, or you can order it on Amazon, I'm sure. But you want to look for liquid food dye. You can throw that stuff directly into the airbrush. You can clean it out with water. And what it means is you can just practice and practice and practice and practice for as long as you wish without having to deal with any color drying on or in the airbrush. Doesn't mean you can walk away with your airbrush with color in it. Still can't do that. But the point is, with food dye, you can sit down and literally paint for 3 hours without having to think about anything other than the technique you're trying to learn. So that's a great tip for being able to just get done. Lots of practice. And by practice, I'm assuming that the person asking this question is referring to improving your trigger control, okay? So that's the best tip I can give you on that. If you want to improve your trigger control, throw some food dye in the airbrush, and that way you can practice onto paper. You know, that's easily available, I guess, for everybody, and for as long as you want. What exercises might you like to do? There's lots of things depending on what you're trying to develop. If you're trying to develop your ability to paint very fine details, then just learning how to do the very, very finest lines that you can do very close up with the airbrush is useful. If you're looking to practice on your aim, then one thing that I think is kind of fun is just lay down a bunch of dots on the page that you're painting, and then just work on connecting them. So with the airbrush, so you're trying to get your line work to go right through the middle of those dots and coming on and off the trigger to start and stop the line as it goes through the dot. That's a great way to start making your airbrush aim and your airbrush trigger action become more and more intuitive. The other one that people always used to teach, which personally I find really difficult, but it is kind of fun, is just writing with the airbrush. So typically you'll hold the airbrush two-handed so that you've got a good anchor, and just, again, using food dye, just do some writing with the airbrush. And that's also a good way of just understanding how the trigger works, getting your fine work down. And don't just do one continuous line like calligraphy. Do it with starts and stops on the trigger. As you can see here, I'm moving my fingers. So if you're doing an eye with a cursive on the top and the bottom, then you'd go one stroke, one stroke, one stroke. And so then you're having to aim the starts and stops of your strokes as well. All of those are great ways to just become more and more and more intuitive with the trigger action of your airbrush, so that when you set down to paint, what you're doing is seeing your creative vision, your picture in your mind, and not having to think about the technique that you're going to use in your finger to make that happen with the airbrush. So food dye, #1 recommendation for that by a long way. Please like and subscribe to the channel. And more than anything else, please comment and give us your questions on the issues that you'd like to know more about. Give us ideas for features, because really the whole point of this channel is just to serve airbrush users and give you more of what you need to know from people like us. Thanks so much for your support.